This week on The Futurists, Ramez Naam.
If we get mass technological job destruction, which I think is still an open question, that's only going to make this sort of trend much, much worse. So we're seeing a warm-up for what that could be, and that warm-up is already terrifying.
Welcome back to The Futurists. I am your host, Brett King, and joining me in the studio is my partner, Rob Tursek.
Hey, Brett,
Rob, I finally stopped for a minute. You know, every week you're announcing when you're doing the Brett's on another flight. So here I am. We're back together. But you know,
you've been everywhere. You were in Brazil. You've been everywhere in the world. It's great. You racked up a smile.
Well, yeah. I mean, this my carbon footprint is a problem. So I'm using airline miles to offset, but it's still I'm going to reduce my travel this year, and I've moved to Dubai to facilitate that. But I thought this week, you know, we have a lot of news coming out of the States, you know, with what's happening with ICE and Minneapolis and the shootings and so forth. I saw Jan LeCun weigh into that yesterday. Our guest today has also weighed into that. It was interesting. Jan LeCun just posted a single word on Twitter. He says he doesn't use Twitter much anymore. And the single word was murderers. And the thing is, everybody knew exactly who they were talking about. He didn't have to say anything else, right? And so we've asked our good friend Ramez Naam, to join us. Ramez, welcome back to the show.
Brett, Rob, great to be here.
Good to see you, Maz. Last time we saw you, you were on stage in Dubai, and you gave a masterful presentation about why artificial general intelligence is unlikely in the near future. We're going to cut that up and send it your way soon, so you can
and also why democracy, I think, might survive, and why it's not going to be a winner takes all, which I think is just
you know, I mean, they're trying their darndest to prove you wrong right now, but
nobody is succeeding with that.
All right,
you know,
the heart of the matter.
I had a good chat with Ben Goertzel this week as well. But you know, a lot of these guys are actually talking about the post AGI sort of arena right now. So you know, anyway, we can get into it, Rob. You know, I think we both agree. You know, and I want to give the external offshore perspective to some extent here, but I think we can agree that this is sort of an immune system response. The conservative response we're seeing in the US seems to be a response not just to the immigration issue, but to the rapid changes that are being thrust upon society by technology itself, right? And the resistance that seems to be coming along is we want to go back to the way it was before. But the rate of technological change is in fact speeding up, and this seems to be accentuating this sort of displacement that's happening, and sort of the reason for these sort of whether it is Le Pen in France or Bolsonaro in Brazil or you know, Boris Johnson in the UK. This does seem to be a bit of a response to the rate of change.
That's right. If people are having a knee-jerk reaction to the rate of change, and people are uncomfortable with change. It makes people nervous. But the funny thing is the mythical past they want to return to never really existed. And certainly if the mythical past involves manufacturing and workers, you know, one family, one member of the household who can pay for the rest of the family, that past is never going to be restored. Mez, chime in here. It's great to have you here today. Thank you for
I'm actually not convinced that it's technological change that is driving this yet. But I do think it's a big risk for the future to drive this further. Like, I do think immigration is a big part of it. I think, you know, the refugee crisis in Europe drove Brexit. The border in the U.S. drove Trump's election. I think woke, which is a word I have mixed feelings about. I think there's some good things about woke. But the idea that you can be canceled for saying certain things, which is true, has been true, maybe exaggerated, but has been true. Or that white men used to be on the top of the food chain are losing that to some extent. I think that has as much to do with it. But I take your point. Like, if we get mass technological job destruction, which I think is still an open question, that's only going to make this sort of trend much, much worse. So we're seeing a warm-up for what that could be. And that warm-up is already terrifying.
That's it. So, you know, 25 years ago, Ray Kurzweil forecasted the singularity, which is the point at which technological change moves so fast that society cannot keep up. And I think people would claim that we're somewhere in the knee of the curve there. We're starting to experience that acceleration. With that change comes sociological change, demographic change, economic change, and so forth. And some of those changes are what the resistance is being built up to. It's not necessarily directed at technology per se, but it does play a role. So
Can I share? Can I share something with you guys while we're talking about this? Because Mez, I want to jump on your stat, your position around techno unemployment. And Rob, we've talked about this many a time, but I don't know if you guys have seen this chart. This is a chart showing the reduction in job openings in the S&P 500 since the emergence of ChatGPT and other AI services. So now this could be correlated with economic activity and things like this, but there could be a fairly strong argument that at least part of this is people aren't hiring entry-level people that they think AI is going to be able to fill the gap on now.
I don't think that fits the data. The drop in job openings just happens way too early for it to be a substantial impact of AI. Like maybe that's there's, like Eric Winolfson and colleagues put out a paper out of Stanford a few months ago that said maybe early career people in most exposed sectors, which is not everything, it's not most of the economy, but, like most exposed white collar work, maybe they're suffering. But even that is I think it's still not a very, very strong finding. And that's 2024, 2025, when you start to see that dip starts in 2022. That is something totally different.
Also, tariffs have play a role here. Most of the businesses I know are not hiring, and they're not making any plans for investment because they just don't know what the tariff situation is going to be a year or two from now. And how can you make a long-term commitment? So hiring is a long-term commitment. That's one of the things that they just put on hold until there's more clarity about the global economy.
Biden started a manufacturing renaissance in the U.S. We had this huge surge of manufacturing investment, a lot of it in clean tech, but in chips and other things. And Trump has canceled it. And the bulk of those projects are being canceled, and manufacturing jobs are now, dropping for a while now.
Okay, so this all comes in the category of fighting the future. What's the motivation for resisting this kind of what's the motivation for resisting green energy or renewable energy?
It's cultural. It's, there's some financial interest at stake, but I think it's a consequence of a societal psychosis we have, that the way we have a zero-sum political system, in the US especially, it's only two parties, and that's a result of how we vote, honestly, that locks in sort of the two-party system. Makes it very hard for third parties to come in. And that means that there's an incentive to criticize the other guy. And so anything that the other team is really bullish on, you have sort of a psychological...
You have to attack.
Hate, because you've got to win points. The only way for the Republicans to gain power is to draw down the power of the Democrats. Or for the Democrats to gain in power is to draw down the power of the Republicans. That's not normal. The vast majority of human interaction is positive sum, right? For me to get richer, you don't have to get poorer. We can get richer together. For America to get better off, China can get better off, and they both have, right? But in the U.S. political system, the only way for one party to gain is the other party to lose. And that's just effed up. That structural issue, along with media incentives to drive outrage and clicks and tap into your amygdala, if it bleeds, it leads, as Peter D. Manis has pointed out for so long, that is the psychosis that U.S. society has.
I have another theory, and Rob and I were talking about this in prep for the show yesterday, and I think it also comes back to the Constitution in the US. I think the emphasis on individual rights is a big part of the psychology of Americans, how they respond to things. Whereas if you look at Europe, it's always about the common good and collective good. Even if you, if you start talking about this stuff, people go, "Oh, that's the tragedy." In the US, they'll say that's the tragedy of the commons, and you need to get over that, and the free market needs to fix it all, right? Whereas, and so even if you look at what's happening with ICE in Minneapolis, some people are still able to sort of internalize that and say, well, it hasn't affected me, and it hasn't affected my family, and it's still getting, they're still getting the immigrants, which is a problem. So, we'll let it go. Whereas in Europe, the response to this, and offshore, I'm seeing the response to this is like, if another country was doing what America is doing today, America would invade them to remove their fascist dictatorship,
Right,
right?
possibly. So I do agree with the latter, and I do think the U.S. is a very individualistic society, maybe the most. Maybe Australia is up there. Australia is more American than America sometimes. But I don't. But we solve tragedy commons all the time. We phased out CFCs, so destroying the ozone layer. We passed a bunch of laws about air pollution, water pollution. That's not embedded in the Constitution. But what is embedded in the Constitution is the structure of government. And the U.S., as a trailblazer in democracy, a lot of constitutions, like in South America, for instance, are basically based nearly verbatim on the U.S. Constitution. But probably parliamentary systems are more effective systems. And a lot of scholars of democracy have written about this. There's a variety of reasons for that. Proportional voting, like in the US, I posted a list of the reforms that I want on Twitter today. You can go check it out. Structural reforms of the Constitution to reduce rogue executive authoritarianism and to reduce extremism. One problem we have is it's one congressional district, one vote. Almost no other place, like no place in Europe, votes that way. In Germany, at the state level, you vote for a party, and any party that gets 5% of the vote gets some representatives in parliament. And that enhances the ability to vote for third parties. It means there's multiple active parties. They form coalitions. It's less zero sum. The U.S. has just an older constitution that is incredible in some ways. The UK has no constitution, right? So the UK is kind of effed. I don't want to be the UK with what's happening in free speech. I don't want it to arrest people for social media posts. That's a problem too. I'm glad we have the First Amendment. But structural things that are subtle about how we structure government, how we divide roles and responsibilities, how we vote, how we structure responsibility, like representation, some of which is not even in the Constitution, by the way. We could fix that issue of proportional voting. There's like a 1910 law, but the Constitution just says the states will pick who they send to Congress, right? We can actually fix that if we wanted to. But those structural issues, I think, more subtly create the conditions for a zero-sum battle between the parties. And then
Jim Jeffries. Sorry, go ahead.
Just want to hit this point again. On top of that, humans are wired to be more attuned to threats than opportunities, to be more driven by outrage than connection, at least in the short term. And so our media landscape in the US, the First Amendment is amazing. It means we're the most free media landscape, and it's a capitalist media landscape. I'm a free speech absolutist, and I'm also a capitalist. But we have this problem that the quickest way to get subscribers, to get ears listening, like back to talk radio, to get eyeballs on cable news, or to get eyeballs and clicks on social media, is to post something that shows you how free this other side is. And so that the combination of the human operating system vulnerability to outrage and the incentive in television news and even more than that, social media drives outrage. We have data showing that humans online in the US are much more extreme than they are offline. And humans online that are heavily online, like me, have a darker view and a more extreme view of the positions held by the other party, right? And the First Amendment actually stops us from fixing a lot of this, but something has to give. So I'd like to see brainstorming and work on changing the business model and incentives of everything from TV news to social media to encourage the most, exposing you to the most thoughtful takes from the other side, instead of exposing you to the biggest idiots and extremists from the other side, which is what happens today.
Well, I think it's certainly true that most Americans have more in common than they have, which divides them. But we don't get to talk about that. I will just come back to your point, Mez. You introduced Australia into the mix here. I will say I love Jim Jeffries' take on this. He says, Australia, we have a constitution. I don't know what it says, but But that's how most Australians probably think about the Australian Constitution. To be honest, I don't know what the Australian Constitution says, but it's sort of a big part of the identity of Americans. But it feels like we've sort of thrown it out. The Fourth Amendment, the Second Amendment, the First Amendment.
We're certainly
there's
getting a
real
crash
challenges to
course.
that.
We're certainly
Yeah.
getting a crash course in the Bill of Rights right now, which probably is a good thing ultimately. As in the context of Minneapolis, I think we should probably talk a little bit about that before the break. You've posted eloquently about that. This seems to be a breaking point or a peak point or maybe a turning point. We certainly hope that's the case.
Yes.
Where this militarized federal bureaucracy with this enforcement arm, this kind of what was originally immigration enforcement, but now it's transmuted into like a private police force for the president, called ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They're now invading cities, occupying cities. It happened here in Los Angeles. It disrupted the city on a level it was hard to understand. Like businesses shut down. People were afraid to leave their homes. They were raiding workplaces. Then it's kind of a roving group, so they go from place to place. Now somehow it's Minneapolis's turn. But in Minneapolis, they ran into organized people on the ground. And this is a leaderless opposition, but it's an organized group that from the time of the George Floyd Black Lives Matter riots or protests in 2020, and also during the COVID shutdown, when people had to find other ways to get organized, and the fact that it's always cold there anyway in the winter, people are pretty good at offline communication. You have this kind of like samizdat network of people. Some 65,000 people in Minneapolis have gone through training on how to be nonviolent organizers of communities for the protection of the community. And this rose up after law enforcement retreated after the George Floyd protests. There was a period of lawlessness, and so communities had to find ways to organize themselves. Now, funny enough, these groups, which I think is laudable, right? This is people taking care of their own neighborhoods and looking out for each other, but they're being demonized in right-wing media in the United States. Just to illustrate the point Brett made a moment ago, they're being demonized as somebody's organizing this group, or they must be getting outside funding from agitators or something. But this group is now encountering really heavy-handed repression from the federal government. Tell me a little bit about your perspective, Ramez, because you've posted a number of interesting points about this phenomenon.
Yes, I think you're right. ICE is a private paramilitary for the president that have been given instructions to wantonly violate the First and Fourth Amendment rights of Americans. We saw that there's secret memos that ICE leadership and DHS leadership wouldn't even let the rank and file see. They'd only show them to trainers, who then instructed to verbally give instructions to ICE soldiers that they should violate the Fourth Amendment, right? Blatantly unconstitutional. It is an invasion. It's a hostile occupying force. I consider it treason, which is a very, very big word. I can come back to why that is. This is a war being waged by the president himself, by his deputies, and by this private paramilitary, brown shirts, against Americans. And the good news is they're losing. They've lost. So my view is right after Renee Good was killed, they had a window of a couple hours where they could have said, we're opening an investigation, like what ordinary police stuff. This officer has been suspended while we're doing an investigation. Right. They don't just say he's guilty. Officer suspended. We're doing an investigation. Yes, of course, we're going to work with Minneapolis PD. And then they could have like buried it or slow walked it. Even if they're evil, like that would have been better. And instead they were like domestic terrorist, blah, blah, blah. No, local and state police can't come to the crime scene. No, we're not going to investigate. No, we're going to instruct the local FBI office, a supervisor there, a woman, got a search warrant to search the car and wanted to launch an investigation of the officer who shot Renee Good. And she was instructed by DC, thank you, Kash Patel, to instead open an investigation into Renee Good as a domestic terrorist. So she quit.
That's Tracy Mergen, who resigned on January 23rd.
The U.S. Attorney's Office there, under the DOJ, under Pam Bondi, who's also a traitor. I'll just be honest about this. We should have a fair trial.
Why don't you tell us what you really think?
And then many, 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 many appeals. And then she deserves, like the Constitution and various laws say she should get the death penalty. And I hate the death penalty. I overall incredibly oppose it. But Bondi instructed the U.S. Attorney's Office there to launch an investigation of Renee Good, the domestic terrorist. So 5 people, including the lead of that office, who was the one investigating like Somali fraud for daycare, quit, right? Like, and I wish people of integrity could stay in the job, but they're sending a clear signal. More importantly, in the polls, Trump lost. Like, most Americans don't support ICE in any way. Like, the majority of Americans now support abolishing ICE. That's amazing. Wow. Americans aren't like that. That never happened with defund the police. Defund the police never got popular. I don't know if it's approval or got to like 20%. Now it's over 50% of Americans say we should abolish ICE. Approval of ICE is like 15 or 19%. These are numbers from before Alex was murdered, right? Disapproval of ICE is like over 50%. So that day or the day after, Trump lost. Vance, who doubles down on the white nationalist arm and associates himself with that, he lost. They lost their Reich. It's never going to happen now. They lost the midterms in the House definitively, modulo like some crazy thing happening. And now the Senate, that was very much a long shot for the Democrats, is in play. And I think the Democrats have a great shot at taking the Senate in the fall. Now that depends upon attaching the president's behavior and ICE's behavior and Miller's behavior and Pam Bondi's behavior and Kristi Noem's behavior to Republican legislators. If people don't make that connection, this won't happen. But if they realize at any point over the last 12 months or before this, at the end of his first term when Trump tried to overthrow the U.S. government, at any point the GOP could have banded with the Democrats, just a tiny slice of the GOP, and removed Trump.
The number is 23 Republican congressmen or senators, just 23 of them. If they had just decided to put a stop to this, they could have. Mitch
McConnell knew, and yet he backed off. He backed off from impeachment or conviction in the Senate, and he was like, oh, the courts should handle it, like normal prosecution. But then, of course, the Supreme Court said he has immunity for official actions. By the way, immunity for official actions means that Biden, at the end of 2024, could have launched a drone strike on Mar-a-Lago. I'm not saying he should have. Destroyed Trump and the whole incoming administration, sent SEAL Team 6 and a few others to mop up anybody that got away, then pardoned everybody. And he said, it's an official action. I have complete immunity. Like, that's, I'm not saying, I think that would have been horrible.
Yeah.
Even more horrible than today, sad to say. It is. Like, you can't have that in the U.S. We should never, ever allow that. But that's an official action. Like, that's what SCOTUS, and I know, I don't
has
think...
opened the door for, Mayor.
I don't think John Roberts is the worst. I think he's actually sort of he's center-right, but that was a terrible fucking decision.
Okay, for the folks who are repeating...
Trump has lost.
Let me give a little context here for...
and I think Virginia does.
For the folks who are listening who are not necessarily in the United States, because we do have such listeners, Ramez made reference to a couple of amendments that are in the Bill of Rights, so the amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The First Amendment is offers the right to free speech. The government shall not pass any law that constrains free speech. The Second Amendment is the right to bear arms, which Mez did not bring up, but it's becoming an issue in this particular matter. And the Fourth Amendment is protection against unlawful search and seizure. And what we've seen in the last couple of months is Kristi Noem, the head of the Department of Homeland Security, has encouraged officers of ICE, this is an enforcement group, to raid homes without a judicial warrant, basically to break down doors and to come into houses and seize people. And this is specifically what is spelled out in the Fourth Amendment of the Bill of Rights.
Not only homes, Rob. They tried to go into the Ecuadorian embassy in Minneapolis yesterday. Yeah. Like, that's crazy, yeah. I think we need to have a quick break.
Okay.
Yeah, let's have a quick break. You're listening to the Futurist podcast with myself and Rob Tursek as your hosts. Our guest today is Ramez Naam. We'll be right back after this break.
Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. and of course its spin-off podcasts, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, and Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show.
Hey, welcome back to The Futurist. I'm Rob Tercek, and this is Brett King and I talking to Ramez Naam, longtime friend, a fellow who's got a great perspective on the global economy, the future path of technology, our dependence on alternative energy and the requirements for that. He's got all kinds of interesting perspectives, but lately he's been saying eloquent and interesting things about civil rights and government oppression. Now, Mez, the thing I wanted to ask you about before the break is, what are the implications of this? The United States seems to have this like paramilitary force, as you said a moment ago. It's rolling back civil rights. People are on the defensive. Now we need to feel like we protect ourselves against our government, which is a very unusual situation, I think, for most people in this country. Not everybody, but most. But we're also seeing that with our allies, or I should say countries that formally consider themselves allies of the United States.
Yeah.
The U.S. has treaties. These are treaties that are authorized by Congress. The president doesn't have the authority to tear them up, but he's threatening to do it. The president is unlawfully using tariffs or the threat of tariffs as a way to punish countries. This is clearly not something the president has the authority to do. So other countries are starting to say, gosh, your checks and balances, the much vaunted checks and balances in the U.S. government don't seem to be working anymore.
Yeah. Well, I think we can divide this into domestic implications for the U.S., which are very important, because the U.S. is an important country, and global implications. Let me start with global, actually. Trump is the great unifier. He'll be seen as the great unifier. He's unified the whole world against the U.S. Trump is inadvertently maybe the best thing that's happened to Europe in decades, because Europe is going to...
That's a fair assessment.
Europe's become more unified. I was saying stuff that, even I felt like might be a little too far over the last couple of weeks, that many European countries and our Asian allies, South Korea, Japan, but Ukraine, Canada, maybe Mexico, Poland, should all be developing nuclear arsenals, right? Nuclear deterrence. And what I'm saying, I hate nuclear proliferation also, but when the U.S. is your possible enemy as
Right.
Canada, how else are you going to deter the U.S. but a nuclear deterrent, right? And if he's threatening to invade Greenland, then of course Denmark should have a nuclear deterrent. And I hesitated to even say that because I thought people were going to just think I'm nuts, and I probably am nuts. In the news today, and I also said I hope that we find out later that there's a secret effort by the UK and France, the two nuclear powers of Europe, to spread nuclear capabilities to other Western democracies, right? In the news today, Sweden is working with the UK and France, negotiating with them on nuclear weapons tech transfer, right? Wow. I trust the Swedes. Of course, more nukes in more hands is inherently unsafe, but now, Russia is a close a threat to Sweden, and when the U.S. is threatening Denmark, their immediate neighbor, yes, I think the Swedes should have a nuclear arsenal. And so South Korea has, the number 2 civilian nuclear industry in the world after only China. They've got the tech. They can develop a nuclear arsenal if they want to. And with China, China's actually mostly quite peaceful, but with China no longer being offset by the U.S. and China being a little bit territorially aggressive in the South China Sea and so on, I think South Korea and Japan and Australia probably will never do it, should have nukes. I'm maybe not as confident that the Philippines should have nukes, but of course they have the incentives. Poland should definitely have nuclear weapons. Ukraine should have nuclear weapons.
So this proliferation is an inherently unstable proposition. So that's going to increase security risk around the world because...
It will in some ways, but it will possibly decrease the risk of conventional conflict.
But what you're pointing out is...
you come back to MAD, right? Mutually assured destruction is the thing that sort of holds everyone back. Warfare is definitely changing. Ukraine has showed that. I think... Mark Carney's comments at Davos were really interesting. And,
Yeah.
Let me give you some perspective offshore from that. Offshore, everyone thought that was a completely reasonable assessment of the situation. Of course, the press reported on it quite differently within the US, especially on the right wing media. But he said it was the end of an era, and I think that correlates with what you're saying, Mez, is that Trump has created, this is an inflection point from this point forward in terms of, how the US will be considered geopolitically. But is this just a symptom of the fall of Rome? Is that what we're seeing with the end of US democracy? And it's sort of like,
We'll get back on track. I hope so. That's like, I have two things that I think are most vital in this world for me to do outside of my own, health and so on. They are, one, to do everything I can to prevent the fall of US democracy, and two, to do everything I can to help the AI transition go positively. Climate has been my passion the last 15 years. It still is, but these things are on more urgent timelines. And a lot of people feel that way. But the US will never be trusted again to the extent that it was if people believe this can happen again. But in the meantime, it's not mere anarchy loose in the world. Now there's a poll in Italy saying most Italians, a majority of Italians, would support Europe becoming more like a federal government, the EU becoming more like a federal government for Europe. People are talking, frankly, about Canada joining the EU. I think we're going to see the emergence of an EU-wide military that's not NATO. So I think Europe is going to end up stronger, more unified, and maybe like in Hungary, in like 80 days, whatever. Hopefully we get rid of Orban and we can bring Hungary back into the fold. And trade, like global trade, has gone up. Even as the U.S. has had tariffs, it's just been without the U.S. Europe and China are negotiating a variety of things, including like bringing in Chinese electric cars. Canada's dropped tariffs on Chinese electric cars from 100% to 6%, which I love. Europe and India just announced a major trade deal. I haven't looked at the details of it, but it's being, proclaimed as a big thing. So Trump is causing the rest of the world, he's causing Europe to come together more cohesively, and he's causing the rest of the world to enhance their collaboration and trade with each other. So maybe that's actually an inadvertent good thing.
There's actually an impact for the U.S. AI exports as well, because European countries are now realizing that by adopting U.S. AI technology, they're going to foster yet another dependence on the United States, what they now consider to be an unreliable and possibly unstable ally. So there may be a movement against that, or a movement to adopt other forms of artificial intelligence. That would have long-term implications for the United States, and it would actually drive the further fragmentation of the web as well.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S., we talk about trade imbalances, but the U.S. is a mass exporter of services, of like using social media, using Google, whatever. And that's now at risk. Europe in particular is going to look long and hard at like how can they cultivate more of that domestically. Now, Europe sucks at that. If I'm just like totally straight up, and read the Draghi report. It's not as homogenous a market as the U.S. It's easier to get network effects in the U.S. that was in the same language and so on. And there's one regulatory framework. So I don't know if Europe will succeed, but I do think it is a threat to the dominance of U.S. tech companies broadly, not just AI, this distrust of the U.S. And I think tech companies, their CEOs, I feel their pain. From Tim, I almost want to call him Tim Apple, from Tim Cook's POV, the rational thing to protect his, multi-trillion dollar company is to suck up to Trump, bring him the occasional $1 million solid gold base for something, say some nice things in public. But you're starting to see pushback from their employees. And no major tech company has stood up to Trump. I totally get it. I understand why, because Trump, like this, can like take $1 trillion off their market cap, can like say, oh, we're just not going to allow exports of iPhones anymore, or Apple can't import anything from China, right? Or whatever. Or like, oh, the federal government's no longer buying anything from Microsoft, and we're launching an antitrust investigation. Like, he can do stuff to make people's lives hell. The fact that they're so powerful and visible makes them vulnerable in a way. But I don't know how kindly people are going to take. I actually have empathy. Like, I separate like the people in tech who have been proponents of Trump. They've got to come to Jesus, and we need to see some amends, or we should do everything we can to reduce their power. people who just stayed silent. I get a lot of likes on tweets from people who are at big tech companies, prominent people in tech, VCs that can't speak out, and I sympathize. And then there's a few, the brave, maybe like 10 people at the senior level in tech that have taken a stand, and they are my new heroes. And some of them I wasn't totally sure what I thought of before, but now I'm like, whatever I can.
Jan LeCun.
Yeah. But isn't that evidence of what the Atlantic called this a fascist regime, right? This week, right? Rob, you pointed that out to me.
I mean, like journalists have been reluctant to use that word, and they finally crossed that. Jonathan Rauch, who writes brilliantly about society, he said, "Look, I finally come around to using that term," and listed 20 different reasons why it's a relevant term or why it's fair to apply it now. The militarization of the government, the browbeating of political opponents, the demonizing of the free press, the attacks on voter rights, and the list is very long, but it's quite evidently true. And now they're finally coming around to using the term. The funny thing about that, conservatives hate it when you call them a fascist, but they're happy to call the other side communist. And I'm not really sure why they're so touchy about that topic. Yeah. I say, if you're going to be a fascist, embrace it. These guys are they're very transparent about their support for white supremacy. They've got the tattoos on their bodies to support it. They're not hiding the fact that this is the agenda.
I want to come back to the U.S. because here's my view on the U.S. Like, there's going to be a rebound. We don't know. In 2028, a Republican could win the White House. The Democrats, maybe it's 50-50 that take the Senate. Like, it's not going to be a clean sweep. But I do think big things are happening. Wisconsin has been a swing state that's gone red. They border Minnesota. Yeah. Trump only took it by 1 point. I think Wisconsin is now blue. I'm not a political pollster. I can't tell you data behind that, but it was like 0.8 points Trump won it by. And Wisconsin and Minnesota are the same culture. They're the same people. Western Wisconsin is red, and Western Wisconsin borders Minnesota, and they're concerned. Iowa is definitely a red state, not a swing state. Trump's approval in Iowa is -9, right? Like, who knows? Like, it's a long time between now and 2028. But even if that happens, one of my fears is, let's say we get all these people out, and the most likely outcome is we don't really punish them at all. Let's say a Democrat wins, or a Republican who's more mild-mannered wins. Have we moved the Overton window and set a precedent that any future president, left or right, will use these authoritarian powers? And it's possible. Mm-hmm. So my view is, think of the Constitution of the U.S. as like an operating system for, a computer, right? It has security holes in it, and we have to patch those holes. We have a variety of things we can do. Many of them require constitutional amendments to limit the rise of authoritarianism, get rid of presidential immunity, or scope it down a lot, get rid of the pardon power. The pardon power allows the president to tell his underlings, go do my bidding. It's illegal, but I'll pardon you, right? There's debate about how independent is the DOJ or the Fed. Constitutionally create the concept of independent federal agencies, make the Attorney General have a 10-year term that can only be ended by impeachment, right? Things make the Fed very clearly separate, put those into the Constitution itself. Empower the states.
Reinforce the check and balances, yeah.
Yeah, about age limits on politicians and limitation on the number of terms.
Get rid of Citizens United. Yeah, there's a lot we could do.
So it's so hard to pass a constitutional amendment. We haven't done that in decades. The Equal Rights Amendment failed, right? Mm-hmm. But if we're going to have a window to do it, this is the first time. So after the Civil War, with Reconstruction, we passed a slate of constitutional amendments that included the 14th Amendment, a very, very important one, equal rights for everyone. And so now is
so let's get into this. Let's do what we do best, right? As futurists, let's talk about what does the US look like in 30 years. What is how do you see this playing out? It's a crapshoot to some extent to be able to forecast this, but if we apply the rules of forecasting to this, what is the global geopolitical situation going to be? Is it going to be, as Ian Bremner says, a technology Cold War, or does this force more unification as AI pushes in, do we need to see more consensus building globally? And what does the US look like in 30 years as a governance structure?
I think there are multiple scenarios, right? The nightmare scenario is this is a nearly unstoppable slide into authoritarianism. That what happened in Turkey, for instance, is about to happen to the US. And whether it's Vance, who miraculously, I think he's hurting a lot right now, wins in 2028, or, maybe Newsom wins, but turns out to be much more of a dictatorial figure. And either way, that we move towards an authoritarian regime. There's another scenario, which is renewal, that this drives civic renewal, states' rights, more pressure on constitutional freedoms, some reforms, and this is part of it creates more of an immune system in the US towards this stuff. Now, on the global stage, I would still say the US has the most dynamic economy of any large economy in the world. It is the economy that does the best job at incentivizing and creating new innovations. The economy that does the best job at creating tech companies. It's the economy that is most nimble and able to incorporate new tech like AI. And that's largely independent of politics. So I actually think the US is going to be the country that does the most creation of new AI stuff, the most incorporation of it into the economy, parts we can hire and fire. If you get another variable, which is, will AI and robotics cause mass technological unemployment? And if so, then you hit a snag, which is the US is not
massive snag. Yeah.
Whereas Europe is potentially better at that, but both Europe and the US have their fiscal houses way out of whack. And that's one thing where I think the few conservatives that really care about this, they're not the ones that have power, are right. The US's fiscal house and Europe's are just incredibly screwed up. The level of debt we have is really not sustainable. It was saying that for a long time, but it keeps growing. And the US has to fix issues around cost of living and taxation. We have to find ways. It's not enough just to control costs or something. We have to find ways to fundamentally make the two things that are most expensive for people, which are housing and healthcare, and then third, education. We have to find ways to actually lower the cost while delivering more value. It's totally doable, by the way. It's not necessarily hard, but it'll be a big wrenching change in society. And we have to put some controls on spending. The economist Alex Tabarrok, I'm a huge fan of and a friend of, proposed something called the unbalanced budget amendment, which I think is just brilliant. It's not a balanced budget amendment. It's unbalanced. And it says this: in times of plenty, the U.S. has, in times of economic growth, the U.S. government is required to run a surplus and use some of that surplus to pay down debt or to save money. In times of economic trouble, a pandemic hits or whatever, the U.S. government is allowed to be in a deficit and borrow money to use for Keynesian stimulus or keeping people alive who've lost jobs. That's way better than a balanced budget amendment, which is very constraining. It's just brilliant. I don't know if we'll ever get that, but something like that has to be done. And we probably need, I'm going to say the most crazy thing I'll say. How to make housing cheap is easy. You just allow...
And healthcare is going to be easy with AI.
I don't think it's with AI. I think with healthcare, the real fundamental problem is in...
Well, but you've got longevity coming in and things like that. I'll give you my perspective, Mez. I'll jump in here as a sort of... All right,
I'd love to hear you. Let me just finish on this. Longevity is derp. There's no longevity tech on the horizon that I believe in, to be honest. Maybe there's a couple I think are interesting, but they're mostly, we're just not there. Longevity, escape velocity, no sign of it. AI will make healthcare more expensive because the issue is not the technology, it's the incentives. As long as somebody, as a third party, is paying for you, and as long as we have the incentive for people that are creating new medical technology to make something that's 5% better but costs 5 times as much, healthcare costs will just keep going like this. So there are 2 ways to control healthcare costs, and one of those can also bring them down. One is price controls. The reason Europe's healthcare is cheaper than the US's is not socialized healthcare, it's price controls, right? People in the US won't stand for that. The other way, and I'm going to get tomatoes thrown at me for this, is you actually need price transparency and competition in healthcare.
Yeah.
80% of healthcare spending is not emergent. It's not emergency care. But nobody, my parents are physicians, my sister's a physician, her husband's a physician. Nobody, no doctor can actually tell you what you'll be charged for anything.
Right.
No hospital administrator can tell you what you're going to be charged.
No hospital posts the prices for any procedures. They do it in Canada. It's right on the wall when you walk in.
The first thing I would do is every provider has to post a price list that is both human and software readable, and it must be the same price charged to everyone, whether you're insured or uninsured. And then I'd make insurance, we talk about insurance, but it's really subscription to healthcare. F that. Like, you should have insurance for really catastrophic things. And then for everything else, it should be pay out of pocket. Maybe the government could offer you like a 0 interest loan if it's an expensive thing. But for like shoulder surgery, you should have to shop around. Those providers should be forced to provide not just a price list, but also like their success metrics.
Performance statistics, yeah.
If I bought a new car, right? I got rid of my Tesla, like F Elon, pardon my French, great man and horrible man at the same time. And I price shopped, right? And that's what drives cars to be cheaper and better over time. And we do the same thing in healthcare. I can rant on this for a while. Sorry, Brett. I'll listen.
No. So I mean, I do want to wrap, and I'm conscious of the time, but I'll give you this perspective. I think if AI does result in fairly significant technology unemployment, and I think it's going to be youth unemployment is going to be the issue, because I think coming out of university, those job openings, they're the ones that are going to be hit the hardest, the fastest. And I think with the alignment that's happening globally, China is saying very clearly climate change is a thing, and Europe says climate change is a thing. There's very little debate over that. The shift to renewables is happening in Europe, it's happening in China. I think that is going to result in a level of automation at the societal level, which the US can't match with its free market engine because they don't have the energy reform. So I think what's going to happen is you're going to have Europe and China align on this stuff. I think you're going to see a lot more consensus building there. I think you're going to see a lot more trading in industrial AI, and you're going to see much more socialist type policies that deal with such as universal basic income, that deal with technology employment, that's going to put the US on the outer. I think that's what we're going to see over the next 30 years.
I think that's a totally plausible scenario.
Mez, it's been great having you on the show. It's been too long. We really want to have you back to talk more about artificial intelligence as well. Thanks for joining us to talk about this particular set of circumstances, this emergency moment in the U.S.
Yeah, Brett, thanks for giving me a platform to rant.
Mez, where can people find out more about you? Where can they find you on the web?
RamezNaam.com, or really just find me on Twitter. At Ramez on Twitter is where I post my thoughts.
Great. So that's at RAMEZ or Z, depending on what country you're in. All right, folks. Well, thanks. This is yet another episode of The Futurists, and Brett and I will be back with another future-minded thinker next week. And until then, we will see you in the future.
In the future.
Well, that's it for The Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.